Today, we will be discussing the cell membrane in two processes called diffusion and osmosis, trying to answer the question of when and how stuff is able to move in and out of the cell. So first, let's have a quick review of the cell membrane and its important functions. The cell membrane is the membrane that surrounds the exterior of the cell. It allows the cell to have a certain shape, and it also holds the contents of the cell inside. The cell membrane is what we could think of as the gatekeeper or the security guard of the cell, in that it determines which materials will be allowed to come in or out of the cell. The cell membrane is what we call semipermeable, meaning it allows some things to pass through and others not. Now let's talk in a little bit more detail about the semipermeability of the cell membrane and how that functions. The word semipermeable can be broken down into its two parts. Semi, meaning some or partially, and permeable, meaning allowing things to pass through. The cell, in order to perform all of its function, will need certain materials from outside of the cell. It will also need to be able to rid itself of waste. This is where the semipermeability of the cell membrane comes in, allowing some of those needed materials to come in and some waste to be able to leave. The cell's semipermeability means that there really are three options for how substances can pass through the membrane into or out of the cell. Some substances will be allowed to cross freely without the use of energy. This is what we call passive transport. Some substances, on the other hand, will be able to pass through, but they will require energy in order to do so. And then some substances, which are not needed to enter or exit the cell, will not be allowed to pass through the membrane at all. Now, before we talk about osmosis and diffusion, we need to talk about the concept of concentration, which is what determines how diffusion and osmosis will take place through the membrane. Concentration simply describes the measure of how much of a substance is contained in a certain space. So if we look over here, you see in this space, there is a large number of molecules. If we have an area where there is a large amount of substance contained in that space, we call that high concentration. Lots of substance inside of the space. When there is a smaller amount of substances or a little amount of substances in a space, we call that low concentration. You can see here that within this same amount of space, there's much less molecules or a smaller amount of substance. Now, before we talk about the processes we will discuss today, I want you to keep this in mind. What the cell likes or what the cell wants is for concentrations to be equal. We call this equilibrium. So what the cell is doing is constantly attempting to reach a state where the concentration inside of the cell is equal to the concentration outside of the cell. Now, let's talk about this first process of how substances move across the cell membrane, which is called diffusion. Diffusion is the movement of substances through the cell membrane from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So when we say substances in this case, we're talking about things called solutes, which are things that are dissolved in the liquid, like salts and sugars. And what these are going to do is naturally, through the process of diffusion, move from an area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. So if we look here, we see that where there is an area of high concentration of molecules, those molecules will diffuse or pass through the cell membrane towards the area of lower concentration. This will continue until equilibrium is reached, meaning the concentration of the substances on each side of the membrane is equal. So if you look here at this image, you will see in the beginning there is a larger concentration of this solute here on the left-hand side. Diffusion will take place through the membrane towards the area of lower concentration until we reach this endpoint where the concentration is equal on both sides. Here's an example of diffusion in the real world. If you were to drop some dye or food coloring into water, you can see that at the very beginning, the concentration of that dye or food coloring is very high at the top. through the process of diffusion, that food coloring is going to diffuse or spread throughout the cup from this area of high concentration through the cup to the areas of low concentration where it's only pure water, until what will eventually happen is that this will completely diffuse and spread out evenly throughout the cup until the entire cup of water is blue. Now let's look at a practice problem of seeing how diffusion works across the cell membrane. So here we're looking at an example of some solutes or some molecules of a solute on either side of a cell membrane. What we want to do is circle the number of molecules that would move and determine which direction they will flow, and then draw what this will look like on either side of this membrane after diffusion takes place. So as we can see in this example, there is a much higher concentration on this side of the membrane than on this side. So we know that the flow of solutes is going to go from high concentration to low concentration. Then all we would need to do is count the number of total molecules and make it so that the number is equal on both sides, because we know that a solute will diffuse until the concentration is equal on either side of the membrane. What that will look like in this example is 6 molecules moving towards the right across the membrane until the concentration of this solute is equal on both sides, which looks like this. The next process that we will discuss today is called osmosis. Now, osmosis is another means by which substances move across a membrane. Osmosis is similar to diffusion, except that it is specifically the diffusion of water through the cell membrane. And in the case of osmosis, the water will travel from areas of low solute concentration to areas of high solute concentration. So if you think back to earlier in the lesson, I reminded you that what the cell wants, or what it is constantly moving towards, is having the concentration of solutes be equal on either side of the membrane. Because of that, water will want to travel from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration in order to dilute or decrease the concentration of the solution in the area where solute concentration is high. This means that water will diffuse from areas of high concentration until the ratio of solute to water is equal. When the ratio of solute to water is equal, meaning there is an equal amount of solute to water in both areas, the concentration is then equal and osmosis will stop. If we look at this example here, we can see that across this membrane, on this side, we can see that the concentration of solute is much higher, meaning that there is a lower amount of water to every solute molecule. Based on what we know about osmosis, we know that water will then want to move from this area of low concentration to the area of high concentration in order to cause that concentration to be equal, or to make the ratio of water equal to the ratio of solutes. Now let's look at an example of what that would look like. As we can see here, we have a semipermeable membrane and some pure water on this side. On this side, we have water with a high concentration of solutes. We know that through osmosis, water is going to travel from the area of low concentration on this side of the membrane towards this side until the concentration is equal on both sides. Now let's look at a practice problem using what we know about osmosis. Here, it asks us to circle the number of water molecules that would move and draw an arrow to represent the direction of that flow, and then draw what this would look like on either side of the membrane after osmosis takes place. In this diagram, the circles represent sugar and the squares represent water. As we can see here, on either side of the membrane, we have a non-equal concentration. We can see that over here, the concentration of solute to water is much higher. We can see there are 3 solutes to only 5 molecules of water, where over here, there is 1 solute to all of these molecules of water. We know then that through the process of osmosis, water will want to travel from this area of low concentration to the area of high solute concentration in order to cause that ratio or that concentration to be equal on both sides. If we were to count the water molecules here, we would see that there are 12 overall. So in order to make it so that the ratio of water to solute is equal on both sides, that means that each one of these solutes needs 4 water molecules to 1 solute. In order for that to happen, 4 molecules of water would need to travel from this area of low concentration across the membrane to this area of high concentration, leaving us with this after image where we can see that the concentration is equal on both sides, with the ratio of solutes to water being exactly equal.